Rob York, you're the Director of Regional Affairs at Pacific Forum in Honolulu. Tell me first about Jae Myung. Tell me about the South Korean president, please.
The South Korean president is a politician.
Yeah.
First and foremost, I mean, lots of people have opinions about him, whether or not he is secretly a communist infiltrator of this country and he is going to betray it in the end to the North Koreans or to the Chinese. There are certainly people who hold that view, and there are certainly people who view him as a savior of the country of sorts, considering what it has been through in the last several months in particular. I tend to just see him as a retail politician, somebody who tries to meet what the people are looking for, and sometimes that leads him to make outlandish promises, and sometimes that leads him to cut deals, I guess you would say. So I just see him as a politician in the end. There are allegations surrounding him, of course, and there are certainly things he's going to promise that he will not be able to deliver, but I also think that he will be constrained by certain factors that no president really has control over, whether it's domestic interest groups or also international conditions.
Can you say something about some of these promises or ideas or any of the specifics that have stood out to you, perhaps?
Well, every Korean president says they're going to make a difference for the people's well-being, of course, and a lot of that is tied up in interest groups. So that's a very difficult promise for any Korean president to keep, especially one facing the kind of domestic headwinds that Korea is facing these days with its aging population. And attempts to address that will run into problems with powerful people, of course. And, there are things that can be done to address the birth rate, such as opening the country up to more people from other parts of the world who are probably looking for the opportunities that Korea presents. But that will cause other problems, other social problems, particularly with those who are not receptive to outsiders and who are very, very tied to the Han Nara idea.
I can say that on ground level, I've received 150,000 won from the president and his policies so far that I can spend in my local district at the shops.
Okay, that's like 10 different trips to 7-Eleven.
Yes, it's exactly that. How was Jae Myung's victory perceived outside of Korea? Did it make any headway in the United States? Did people talk about it? Is there any opinion?
I would say that there were certainly people who thought that it was a good thing compared to his predecessor. So people who saw the martial law declaration and who were really aghast at that were definitely happy to see somebody of a different mindset get elected and see the former president's party defeated in that election because, of course, people in that party were hesitant to condemn the martial law declaration, and that is certainly something that a lot of outside observers found off-putting. Now, of course, there are those who, again, see Jae Myung as unreliable or even a traitor, and those are people who probably did not greet his presidency with welcome. But I'd say for the most part, to those who did notice this, they probably saw Jae Myung's victory in this last election as probably the better of the two outcomes, although I will say that expectations for him are relatively low compared to his predecessors. I think there's a lot of sentiment toward him which says, well, Korea has these structural difficulties with its population and its economy that are going to be hard for anyone to overcome. But other people see him as somebody who really kind of tells people what they want to hear, and this does not necessarily translate into, I guess, it doesn't necessarily translate into somebody who's going to do the right thing under all circumstances.
You've said that there are people who view him as a traitor or selling out the country, a communist, and yet he seems to have run and position himself almost as a centrist, like this kind of, I don't know, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton. How do you see that, his kind of ideological shift? Is that something you've noticed?
Centrist conservative, wasn't that the term that he used?
It might be.
Yes. This is a very different set of circumstances this past year has been for him compared to when he ran last time in 2022. back then you had a Biden administration that was really looking to deepen connections with Korea at all levels, and Yoon Suk-yeol was promising essentially to go along with that. And so it made a lot of sense at the time, if you're going to paint yourself as contrasting with your opponent, that you're going to want to say, okay, we're different. We're an independent country. We have an independent foreign policy. So it's necessary for us to balance and try to work with China as well as work with the United States. Now, in 2025, things are very different. There is a administration in the United States which is open to the possibility of lessening its commitments to South Korea. And if you're in that position, if you're Jae Myung, and you're already thinking about what happens when you take over after the election, because pretty much everybody knew he was going to win, the concept of balance becomes very different. Now the question is, how do I keep the U.S. engaged on the peninsula? How do I prevent a withdrawal? How do I prevent us from falling completely under the shadow of China? That presents a very different set of prospects, many of them quite worrisome for a country like Korea, a country of Korea's size. So now the question becomes, how do I keep the United States engaged? So that meant really, I would say, toning down some of the rhetoric from the past and trying to think about how to maintain that balance, keep the United States on the peninsula, while also, I would say, trying to lower the tensions with China. That's something I fully expect him to try to do.
He's been successful thus far, it would seem. This shift from Yoon Suk-yeol and the Conservative Party to Lee Jae-myung and the Democratic Party, how do you view the left and the right here in South Korea? Being from the United States, the Republican, the Democrats, Labour and Conservative in the United Kingdom, where I'm from, how do you see the difference here in South Korea? Because it is different, isn't it?
Yes, it certainly is. Until fairly recently in the United States, there was a conservative party that was very much tilted toward small government and toward individual freedom. And so that was the emphasis, whereas in Korea, there's much more of a history on the Korean right of an interventionist government, and particularly in economic affairs, and also in defending the legacy of that intervention and of the decisive action that was taken by Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, and to an extent even Lee Seung-man before that. And that, I think, also contributes to the martial law declaration. If you've been saying for some time that there are times when martial law, when decisive action is necessary to save the country, that leads to circumstances like what we saw last December. So Daniel Tudor, who I think you know well, once said that the Conservative Party is basically Park Chung-heeism. So that seems to be the perspective of South Korean conservatives for the most part. On the left in Korea, what separates them from the left in the United States, I'd say, is the nationalism. In many ways, the South Korean left are even more tied to the idea of South Korea as a unitary party, ethnicity, race, state than the conservatives are. So that leads to their emphasis on their past ties with Japan, and also on the kind of labor purism that you see on the South Korean left. So they have a degree of insularity, I would say, whereas in my country, and probably in yours too, the left-leaning party is something of a melting pot for not just people who look like us, but people who have been from families that immigrated there over time and prefer the opportunities that come with the left-leaning party and its policies.
Love the description of Park Chung-heeism as the Conservative Party. I saw Daniel Tudor last week, actually, for coffee. Good luck with your kids, Daniel. He's having a hard time. The martial law that you've mentioned a couple of times here, many of us here in South Korea just slept through it. My phone went crazy, and so I heard all about it. But how was that perceived in the United States, this martial law?
I woke up early that morning. It was something like 4 a.m. in Hawaii, and because
That's early.
Yeah, because periodically that happens when you're an adult. Yeah, the 8-hour night of sleep is a myth for most people, based on based on the human species and its past. But anyway, I woke up and I received a message from somebody, one of Pacific Forum's former fellows, actually, who is based here, was messaging me this and saying that there had been a martial law declaration. And at first I thought it had to be some kind of joke. And so I looked into it and found out that, yes, in fact, there had been a martial law declaration and that it was underway. But as soon as we saw the Minjudong politicians going into the National Assembly, getting in there without being stopped by the military, then you could tell it was going to fail. Regardless of whether or not the vote proceeded, this meant that the military was not firmly committed to halting the democratic process. In terms of how it was perceived, there was definitely a lot of attention to Korea in the days that followed that. Of course, this is, a month after the U.S. election. And so a lot of people who were very disappointed in the United States election were actually inspired by Korea during that time period and said, this is how you should respond to an authoritarian party. This is how you should organize and react and basically take decisive action in order to prevent this kind of takeover by an authoritarian power. And so for a lot of people, Korea was inspirational, I suppose. There are certainly some, and this developed over time, I would say, some who did come to see the martial law declaration as something that Yoon Suk-yeol was justified in doing. But I don't think that opinion holds any legal water or procedural water, honestly. Anyway, there are a few people in the time since then who have looked at the conditions that led to the martial law declaration and said the fact that happened, the fact that a president saw that as an option and that there were those who supported them, that's troubling. That's the fact that was under discussion presents some long-term problems, and I think that is definitely a point that needs to be considered. There need to be questions asked about why they see that as a valid option under the circumstances. But yes, that's a question that I think a lot of mature democracies are going to have answered at some point in the near future, because we are in a period in contemporary history, contemporary global affairs, where a lot of people are questioning whether or not the tenets of liberal democracy should be honored, or whether or not they are actually constraining national glory, national success in many countries. We're seeing that. And so I guess it's good in the sense that South Koreans have been tested with that, and they have responded to it appropriately. But there are definitely questions about how we got to this point.
Isn't it wonderful, or do you find it interesting, perhaps, that South Korea has something to teach the world about mobilization that you spoke about democratization, about action, collective response? Because when I see my international students from North America and their faces when they see pictures of protests in South Korea and mobilization and impeaching presidents, their eyes sort of light up, and as if to say, wow, that's how you do it. Whereas my students from Singapore will say, what's that? They've never seen that. South Korea's democracy and the way how active it is and how effective it is, it's interesting that it might have lessons for the world in that sense.
Yes. And I think South Korea certainly has a history of that kind of action. I guess you can go back as far as the March 1st demonstrations and how those were really honored. What people might not know about me is that I'm a historian, first and foremost. I came to international relations kind of in an indirect way, but my actual degree is in history.
Congratulations on the PhD.
Thank you very much. And looking, my dissertation is actually about the protests that drove Lee Seung-man from power and how they were covered by the international media or the Korean media, I should say, the domestic Korean media. And one thing that is very easy to pick up if you're studying the media from that period of time, the 1950s and early 1960s, is that there was a emphasis on carrying forward the spirit of the March 1st demonstrations. And that was really emphasized by the Syngman Rhee government in the 1950s. And I'm sure that what they meant by carry forward the spirit of March 1st is we're going to keep the influence of Japan out. and we're going to mobilize for the country, the greatness of the country, and we're going to keep the country independent. But a lot of student groups who were empowered by the Lee Sung-man regime probably over time came to hear that and think, we are going to defend democracy. We are not going to accept tyranny. And that's what we saw happen during the April 1960 demonstrations. They rose up against Lee Sung-man's regime and they overthrew it. Now, of course, after that, they fell into the period of military rule, and the military rule period was able to, in a sense, co-opt that revolutionary fervor for national growth, emphasizing it in a way that Lee Sung-man did not. But over time, you do see that reemerge in the 1980s, and so they rose up, they rebelled against the military rule at that period of time, and that, in a sense, solidified the tradition of organized protest in this country. And so it is something that people can certainly learn from in other countries, and it's definitely something that they respond to in other conditions. I remember in 2019 they had demonstrations here in response to the Hong Kong protests as well. That said, there are lessons, and it's possible to learn the wrong ones from that sort of protest. And it's wrong to assume that the presence of demonstrations and the presence of protesters means that victory for democratic principles is inevitable. At least part of the reason why the protests in 1960 were successful is because, well, for one thing, the United States had more or less turned on Syngman Rhee by that point, and their response to the April 1960 demonstrations was, this needs to stop. You can't keep doing this. And when that happened, Lee Sung-man's days were numbered by that point. In the late 1980s, I think there was a similar souring on Chun Doo-hwan and his regime as well. In the absence of another power that the authoritarian dictatorial regime can respond to, the idea of overthrowing a leader or overthrowing a dictatorial power becomes considerably harder. And I think that's what the Hong Kongers encountered in 2019. So that spirit of protest is one that is certainly useful in preventing unchecked power. That's certainly useful. But be careful in assuming the success of such movements.
And now South Korean protests are relatively safe, organized. They're almost sort of like a baseball game. I don't mean to downplay any possible violence or tragedies that have taken place, but they went through years of oppression and violence and deaths and blood and gas canisters and all of this. And now they take place almost like sport events on a regular occasion, it seems, downtown. This seems like the position to ask you about the relationship between South Korea and America. You've already mentioned sort of America's role with Lee Sung-man, Chun Doo-hwan. Break us into ROK-U.S. relations, Rob, please.
Well, they're certainly going to enter into a period of uncertainty going forward. And I know that there will be a lot of questions about how Jae Myung is going to get along with the Trump administration. And I've said in the past, I've even written in the past, that if there's an interaction on a personal level, I think that Jae Myung understands the assignment. Some of the things that he said in the lead up to the election, you could again tell that he was prepared for what is going to face him the day he took office, and that was he was going to have to deal with an American regime that is uncertain about what its role in the Korean Peninsula going forward. And so emphasizing the importance of U.S. troops, emphasizing the deal-making skill of the American president. That's something that he repeatedly said, is that Donald Trump is a master deal maker. People can certainly debate whether or not that is the truth, but we can all agree that that is how Donald Trump presents himself, and that is certainly how he views himself. So he tried to play to that viewpoint. And he also said something very interesting about how Donald Trump's assassination attempt was worse than his own. Yeah, if you look at it from the perspective of which actually did more damage, clearly Jae Myung came much closer to dying. But that's that's what I mean when I say that he understood the assignment. He's playing to Donald Trump's. He's reaching out to Donald Trump and trying to speak to him in a way that he thinks the American president will appreciate. He came away from their negotiations over tariffs with a deal that I'm sure that South Korean people do not find ideal. But if you ask the Swiss, you can certainly see how it could have been worse. So there is going to be a period of time for now where there will probably be a feeling out process, but Donald Trump is probably not going to direct his ire at South Korea for the time being. Whether or not he comes back to that at some point in the future and decides that he wants more out of the relationship, I would actually expect that in the next few years. But for the time being, Jae Myung has negotiated on the whole a relatively favorable deal for South Korea. So now the question becomes, how does he lower the temperature with China without getting the ire of the conservatives around Donald Trump? I don't think Donald Trump necessarily looks at his negotiations with China and thinks that's a deal breaker. He needs to stop that. But there are people around the American president who might feel that it is. So doing that while also trying to make a favorable impression on the United States is something that this South Korean president is going to have to do going forward. And I think one of the things we haven't really touched upon yet is Jae Myung's ongoing relations with Japan. And I think that those will probably proceed relatively favorably for the time being. How the Korean public chooses to demonstrate on Liberation Day will certainly be something to watch. But I think the South Korean president understands that good relations with Japan are for the best for the time being. I don't think he's Yoon Suk-il, but I also don't think he's Moon Jae-in.
That's important, the relationships with Japan. It's interesting you talk about Jae Myung almost praising or knowing how to play Trump, knowing the assignment in your words, because that's something that also Moon Jae-in did when he was in charge. He spoke about a Nobel Peace Prize for President Trump, and that's something that would be unheard of amongst American Democrats, that the Democrats here in South Korea, certainly Jae Myung and Moon Jae-in, they've played nice with Trump almost, or at least they're doing what's expected of them. I don't see Jae Myung singing American Pie in the White House anytime soon, but that relationship is quite important. Very skillful. Can you say something before we come into Japan and China about Korea and Trump as well, about Korea-American relations more broadly over history? Because it's fascinating to me that various episodes and people I speak to, America is either the savior or America is the colonizer imperialist.
Yes.
And as a historian, as what you've done, how do you view the relationship between these two over the last 100-odd years?
Well, you and I think, are both appreciators of the work of David Fields and the work that he's done on the negotiations that Lee Seung-man took part in with the United States before and after he became South Korea's president. So the work that he did there. And this is a point that repeatedly came up in my academic work, is that both Koreas are very realist in orientation. I don't know if they would use that term necessarily, but they are very realist in their outlook toward the great powers of the region. And for those who are less nerdy regarding international relations, I want to make clear that being realist in orientation is not the same as being realistic. It's a belief that there are great powers in the world and there is no force that is naturally going to restrain them. They are going to do what they are going to do. And so both the Korean leadership up to the democratic period of time and the North Korean leadership really throughout at least the first two generations, and arguably the third of leadership, have really understood that they will need the great powers and they will need to work with the great powers, but they cannot trust them. They cannot rely upon them. Syngman Rhee understood that, and he not only played to the United States interests and tried to present an active U.S. military or an active U.S. presence on the southern half of the peninsula as being in the United States' interest, but he also was skilled at playing to their ideals, particularly the Christian ideals of Americans. He was a Methodist, of course, and he had very good ties with the Christian communities in the United States. And I'd say one of the major findings of David Field's work is that he was able to play to that in a way that left the American government of the 1940s unprepared to withdraw from the Korean Peninsula entirely and say, this is not our problem. American Christians would have revolted at that idea and said, this is our problem if the brave Korean people who have resisted, Japanese rule throughout this period of time are now abandoned to communism completely. And so there was a manipulation of those ideals and the idea of America as the city on the hill to really ensure an American presence on the peninsula. And Syngman Rhee continued to do that throughout his rule, is really try to play to Americans and their views of their country as a bulwark against communism, and also to convince them that it was not in their interest to abandon a peninsula that they had fought for 3 years previously. And this continues really, I'd say, throughout the period of time that came after. Lee Sung-man, Park Chung-hee also was realist in orientation. He allied with the United States. He worked with the United States, but he was more than happy to defy the United States and their ideas of economic planning as well. And that is a big part of why they have been so successful, why they were so successful in terms of developing the country the way that they did. So, Chun Doo-hwan is considered an extension of Park Chung-hee's rule in many respects as well. The North Koreans, it's a little bit different. He wasn't so much playing to communist ideals, but he was certainly playing the Russians against the Chinese and seeing them as adversaries of one another in their own right and saying it's in your interests, both of you, to keep us on your side. So that's why Daniel Pinkston likes to call the North Koreans the world's greatest realists, and I would say don't count out the South Koreans in that regard either. So the South Koreans, there's a tendency among Americans, I think, to see the South Koreans as the greatest success story in terms of what the U.S. alliance system can do, in terms of what they've accomplished. There's also a tendency, a really, I'd say, unfortunate tendency among some people on the right, especially to view them as ungrateful and to see them as a people who have benefited from the United States alliance but haven't really shown the thankfulness that they would like to see for that success. That's unfortunate, and I think that might be continuing with the current administration as well. We will see if his view toward the South Koreans has evolved since the first time he was in office, and he was unhappy about Parasite winning Best Picture and other things like that. But I think there are certainly people within the administration, like the Secretary of State, who I would say values Korea for what it is. There are others, I think, like the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, who want to see South Korea take charge of its own defenses regarding North Korea and want to see the United States forces directed toward China itself. And so to what extent South Korea is prepared to handle its own defenses and really mobilize to meet those purposes will go a long way in making sure that favorable impressions of South Korea are found within the Trump administration, essentially. Now, when the summit meeting takes place between President Lee and President Trump, I don't expect President Trump to put President Lee on the spot about his stance on China. I don't think that that's the lens that he views South Korea through. If he's going to put President Lee on the spot about anything, he's probably going to ask him about how much are you prepared to spend on your own defense? Do you acknowledge the fact that we've spent a lot on your defense? what are you going to do about building more facilities in the United States? Things like that. That seems to be the American president's emphasis when dealing with South Korea.
It's if South Korea and North Korea are both realists, as you and perhaps Dr. Pink would say, in the international relations sense, how do we understand Trump and his policy towards this peninsula? Is it just economic? Is it just deals? Is there a pithy way to describe what President Trump, how he views this part of the world?
The administrations that Donald Trump has put together, both the first time and this last time, I would say, are more hardline toward China than the president himself is. And so there has been an emphasis on China as the pacing threat, the strategic competitor, the challenge of our times amongst all of the major personnel that the president has put together, I would say, in both cases. And so while he probably thinks about it more from the perspective of China also benefiting from the United States' generosity and also using the tools of economic statecraft in order to enrich itself at our expense, the individuals around him are much more inclined to see the view of China as this all-encompassing threat and as a threat in the economic but also military and diplomatic domains as well, and to respond accordingly. So for the American president, when he looks at South Korea, what we have consistently heard is that he wants to keep the peninsula safe. He said that, I think, the night that he won the election the first time, he actually called Park Geun-hye up and said, we're going to be safe together. So he is not necessarily, he's not prepared to just abandon South Korea. That's not in his interests. But at the same time, there has been a view of South Korea as having benefited at our expense. And that's not the view that economists have, certainly. They would certainly say that South Korea's prosperity over the last several decades is in everyone's interests and not just their own. So that's the view that they have, and that's the view that I have as well. But this president wants to see, I guess, more returning of the favor, and so more investment in tech, particularly in southern and midwestern states, will go a long way. There's been a degree of that, so wanting to see that continue. And this really speaks to understanding the assignment. I'm sure you've seen the Make American Shipbuilding Great Again memorabilia. So that again is something that the administration understands the United States wants to see. That's actually part of Secretary Hegseth's initial plan, is to restore American shipbuilding and rebuild the industrial base.
Do you see any troop reduction or anything like that happening? Because there were reports in the last couple of weeks that that's again being discussed, that the South Korean military, the manpower is down because of fertility rates. There's always talk about South Korea developing its own nuke. South Korea is not an impoverished nation anymore. It's doing well. Is it capable of defending itself? Should it be capable of defending itself, or is this relationship more important?
Defending itself from North Korea, it is capable of defending itself, and it's certainly, if not capable of defending itself right away from whatever North Korea could throw at it, it's certainly capable of acquiring that ability. It is certainly capable of doing so. There's just a much broader set of concerns that come with the withdrawal of troops from this part of the world, which is, are we actually willing to give up the influence that we have over South Korea? Are we willing to make them, but also other countries that we work with in the region, question our willingness to help them? So that question, while North Korea and its capacity to attack the United States and subjugate South Korea is less of a concern at the moment, because North Korea has its eyes elsewhere, and South Korea's capabilities are certainly far more advanced than they were after the Korean War. There are other questions, namely about China. And basically, if the United States is going to back away from South Korea at this point, what reason do other countries in the region have to trust the United States' commitment? Troop withdrawal is the sort of thing that is going to be an ever-present concern. For all we know, it could be announced this afternoon, but it's not
On
going
Twitter.
to be. Yeah, it's one of those things where you can tell it's on the table, and it has been for some time. But at the same time, I think that's one of the issues that would actually cause Senate Republicans to revolt against this administration, and I think that is something that he doesn't want to see happen. So it's something that even if they arrive at that conclusion, there's going to have to be something leading up to it, I would think, because that would be a very decisive course of action for this president to take, and one that it would be hard to undo once it were announced. So it's something that none of us really know. None of us really know when or if it will be announced, but it's something that we're all keeping in the back of our minds.
And a lot of well-meaning and strong people, they care about the relationship between South Korea and America and the sacrifices that have been made and the efforts over the decades and the lives lost. And so I agree that it's very important. I'm still thinking of this image, Rob, of President Trump phoning Park Geun-hye on the night of his inauguration, and just how much has changed since then.
Yes.
More so in South Korea than it would seem in the United States. Should we be scared of North Korea? I mean, you're visiting here, South Korea, for 3 weeks or so. Do you wake up in the night at 4 a.m. and going, oh my God, North Korea?
Not at all. No. No. I mean, I lived here for 7 years, of course,
Yeah.
and so there have certainly been moments where we were wondering about the future, especially after the Yeonpyeong bombardment in 2010. That was an episode that had a lot of people wondering about what was the chain of events that was going to follow that. Nobody thought the United States or South Korea were going to literally, launch a decisive counterattack in response to that. But there was a question of will, events continue to escalate to a point where they eventually do result in the exchange of, heavy weaponry on, both sides of the DMZ. But since then, not so much. The Kim Jong-un regime and its view of South Korea and how it approaches South Korea has been different. I mean, even in periods of time like, say, 2013, when they were more or less saying all the foreigners should leave, we don't want to risk their safety, things like that. We could kind of tell that was just a way of speaking, a way of trying to bluster against South Korea in a way that diminishes their international position and their international prestige. And South Koreans have generally learned not to overreact to that. So, no, I don't look at North Korea as the kind of... we haven't seen anything like Yeonpyeong ever since.
That's good.
We haven't seen that kind of attack on South Korean people in that period of time. They do provocative things still periodically, but the fact that they've declared that unification is off the table and the fact that they've committed troops to Russia's cause in Ukraine seems to suggest that their priorities are elsewhere. Yeah, that has certainly got implications for how United States and South Korea approach them in the coming years, none of which are terribly promising, but no, I don't look at North Korea as a ever-present threat to the safety of those I care about.
Do you see a Trump-Kim summit? That would be number 3. Number 4? They did Hanoi. They did.
It would be their fourth
Singapore.
meeting.
Fourth meeting, yeah.
Yes. The third thing at the DMZ wasn't so much a summit as a spontaneous gathering.
Is there going to be another one? Should there be another one? I mean, because this is something it was kind of almost unprecedented when President Trump did it the first time. It was strange to see, almost. Is there talk being another one? Do you see there being another one in the next 3 years?
I'm not aware of any discussions regarding a North Korean summit, and whether or not there is another one really depends on Kim Jong-un, because whether or not they can get him back to the table, I think, is really the question. He has not shown much indication that he is interested in further discussions with the United States, and certainly not with the South Koreans at the moment. So does he want to do that sort of thing? Does he want to risk his own domestic prestige again for a country and for a leader that left him empty-handed last time? I think is very much an open question. And I think that will, in some respects, be tied to how the situation proceeds in Ukraine, whether or not Russia and the major gamble that it took there pays off for it. If Kim Jong-un feels relatively secure in his position, as he did in 2017 when they had more or less secured the nuclear deterrent that they were looking for, or Kim Jong-il in 2000 when they had weathered the worst of the famine and were starting to come out of that, then he became willing to talk to South Koreans and Japan more after that. Basically what I'm saying is if Kim Jong-un feels a certain degree of security, he might be open to more talks, more discussions, putting himself out there for the international community again. But we haven't seen much indication that he's interested in it at the moment. Whether or not the Trump administration would go for it, if the president sees an opportunity to make those kind of positive headlines, then yes, I believe he will go for it. But that's months away, maybe even years. And whether or not it should happen, whenever you're talking about North Korea and dealing with North Korea, you've always got to discuss it like, is this a good thing under the circumstances? Is this a good thing in comparison to other options that might be pursued? A summit with Kim Jong-un is better than other actions. It's better than, say, threatening a preemptive strike on their facilities. When the summit was being discussed, I think a lot of us thought this is probably not going to result in what President Trump thinks it will, but at least he's no longer talking about the bloody nose option. So it's a relief. It was a relief in that sense. And nowadays, I think there are concerns with elevating the prestige of someone like Kim Jong-un, especially when he doesn't take steps that indicate a willingness to change on his behalf. There are problems associated with helping him out when he is not willing to, change in any way, any meaningful way. But there are worse options that could be pursued.
And he's doing something, at least generally, or he has done. I remember reading you write about Biden's approach, which was President Biden's approach, which is essentially nothing. And for me, it was interesting to see Kim Jong-un coming out of North Korea, particularly sort of coming towards the south, not going to Russia and China, but coming south. That was always interesting.
Yes.
Turning now perhaps to China, which we've spoken a lot about. Before we talk about China, can I ask you about communism?
Yes.
What's communism, Rob? I know it's a ridiculous question, but I was at a talk last night and the word comes up so many times, and I feel we never sometimes stop to say, what does that mean? What is it? How do we understand this?
Communism is the last stage in Marx's teleological view of history, obviously, where, we've achieved a perfect community because nobody can remember a system of private property and class exploitation. Communism was a term that Americans apply, broadly speaking, to the countries in the communist bloc, but it's my understanding that the Soviets applied the term communism to themselves, saying they'd achieved that state, and that the other countries around them, Andrei Lankov has written more about this, but the other countries around them were socialist countries. They were workers' parties, et cetera, et cetera. They were at an inferior stage of development. So the Soviets used the term communism for themselves as a way of positioning themselves at the top of that pecking order. And, you see other countries, including the Chinese, try to, also apply communist to themselves. But if you look at most of the other countries within that orbit, they still use the term socialist or workers' parties, generally speaking. I mean, communism, I think, in terms of what we are defining and what it means for international relations, I think this idea of a one-party state, that operates without checks and is authorized to make not only decisions with absolute authority in the political realm, but also the economic realm. I think that's what we are thinking of when we talk about communist China and what it means to deal with communist China. There have been a lot of questions that have been raised in recent years after a period of considerable economic exchange between China and the United States and the United States' partners about what it means to give leverage to actors within the Communist Party system in China when they don't have the kind of government private sector distinction that we recognize. So if we are considering investment from a Chinese firm in a critical sector of the U.S. economy or of the economies of our friends and partners, it's like, what does that mean? What kind of risks does that present? Because the company that we're dealing with cannot simply tell the CCP, no, I won't do what you say. They are obligated to listen and to obey. So that is something that we are having to consider. What does that mean? Okay, what does it mean for us to accept large numbers of Chinese students into our universities when they can be used to harass dissenters, when they can be used to spread the messages, that the CCP wants to see spread in our communities, and can attempt to silence the CCP's critics. So all of those things are now being considered when we talk about communist China. What is communism? That's a very complicated question, and one that a lot of political theorists and economic theorists can go into. But for the purposes of our discussion, I would say that when we talk about communist China, we're talking about an entity that does not recognize limits on its authority.
I can't help but think that President Trump would make a good communist based on your definitions of it there.
I'm not going there, sorry.
Yes. No. What I've found interesting with China, and again, this is just a broad observation to see if you have anything of it, is that I have students from all over the world, including China, in my class. And if I ask these students to name a Korean pop song, a movie, a drama, they all can. They're here in Korea, but they can. And then I would ask them, and they're often K-pop fans, or they're often into K-culture. Can you name a Chinese movie, a Chinese song? And they look at me and they suddenly realize they can't. And I find this fascinating, and I want to try to introduce them to some music or some movies that I like. I found it really interesting that a lot of China seems to be behind an intentional firewall, that we don't get much of China in the Western world. And it's kind of almost not misunderstood. There was a YouTuber called I Show Speed who went to China. You heard about this?
Yes, I did.
Going around and doing this, and it sort of shocked people a little bit. How do you feel about our perceptions of China and how this works in a digital media world and our understanding of it? How do you see China in the 21st century?
Well, I think we all can recognize wolf warrior. I think
Yeah.
that's a term that has been popularized. Whether or not people know that comes from a movie in China may be unclear to people. But yes, that degree of Chinese popular culture has broken through the barrier, as has the three-body problem. So
Great book.
those are some areas where Chinese popular culture has begun to break through. And I think there is a degree to which Chinese popular culture did start to penetrate, I'd say in the 2000s. You remember the movie Hero, I presume, with Jet Li.
Okay.
Yes, that was a movie that a lot of people saw. A lot of people in America saw. Very beautifully shot, very, very well acted. But a few people reported being very uncomfortable with the movie's message at the end, and how the subtitles were translating the concept of Tianjia as what was it? Our land. That's how the subtitles translated, our land. Whereas in Chinese, it's under heaven, which basically is a commentary on the authority of the. Let's say it would have been the imperial government at the time, but basically this is a way of saying the ruling authorities in China have this kind of authority of basically all under heaven. So that made people very uncomfortable. I remember the fascist term being thrown around a lot at the time. But regarding China and popular culture, I've read a degree of commentary about this, and how people talk about works like The Three Body Problem and others, even those that have kind of penetrated the broken out of the bubble, I guess would be the better term for it. They've broken out of the Chinese bubble, and they say that this tends to reflect on the Chinese mindset, and that a lot of these movies talk about how they are presenting this more collective view of problem solving. And Wolf Warrior, it's my understanding that movie was a lot about stopping foreign drugs, foreign drug smuggling, something that they have really emphasized pretty much ever since the Opium Wars. So I think this concept of the Chinese bubble, and whether or not we don't understand it, to a degree, I would say that is because Chinese popular culture is produced with China in mind, and that's a mentality that a lot of people outside of China don't really relate to. And so that, I think, explains part of it. I hesitate to say China when I talk about these things, because I want to say that a lot of the things that I and my organization will say, we are directing a lot of our criticisms at the CCP. We are directing a lot of our thoughts and our concerns toward the PRC and the CCP, and how they view themselves in the 21st century and beyond. Our quibble is not with China. Our quibble is not with Chinese people, per se. I mean, Chinese diasporas have made an enormous contribution to the communities that they've been in, and we welcome them for the most part. Those who have explicit ties to the CCP, that raises a different set of questions. But China is not our enemy. The CCP is an adversary.
What makes it an adversary? Is it the control, the inability for people to be able to say no to it? What is the factor that makes it adversarial?
China, the CCP, the PRC, for a long time, we talked a little bit earlier about Park Chung-hee and his system of rule. For a very long time, I was fascinated by Park Chung-hee and how he governed, because at a time when it's easy to think of dictators and authoritarians as people who simply crush dissent and enrich themselves, Park Chung-hee seemed to view his role as to take authoritarian means in order to accomplish practical ends and beneficial ends. And over time, you see this happen in other places, like in the Chiang regime in Taiwan, the Lee Kuan Yew government in Singapore. These are all what we would, in the West, call authoritarian regimes that succeeded in uniting and enriching the peoples that they were in. And I think for a very long time, I and others looked at the CCP and thought that was the course of action that they were on. They were pragmatists. They were not committed to communist ideals per se. They were committed to the enriching of their country. And we also saw in Taiwan and in South Korea how steps like this were really precursors to democratization. And we assumed that once the people in China achieved a certain degree of wealth, a certain degree of well-being, they would rise up and demand greater democratic representation for their countries. Again, there were mitigating factors in Taiwan and South Korea, and that included having a democratic benefactor in the United States and its partners that would, over time, want to see changes in terms of how they govern. China doesn't answer to anyone like that. That's one of the major differences. Another major difference is that, contrary to the views that I once had, and I think the views that many others in this community once had, is that there is a Communist Party ideology, modified to an extent, but there is a view that China is working not toward democracy per se, but restoration of what it believes to be its right to a hegemonic position here in Asia especially, but also a return to Middle Kingdom status and essentially being able to center the world economy around itself and rewrite the international rules. So you can see that as a natural progression for a great power. Even if you look at it outside of a moralistic lens and say this is just what great powers do, and that is certainly what certain people in the United States, including the current United States government, think of China, that it is a naturally rising great power and that it will behave as a great power does. We need to understand this will change things for China's neighbors, and this will change things for other parts of the world. If you are one of the countries in China's periphery, you will note that China will attempt to increase its share of your waterways, naturally speaking. It will attempt to unite, forcibly or otherwise, with the country that is fabricating most of your semiconductors. And if people in other countries think that China's hegemony will continue unabated and they in their own countries will be free to criticize it without repercussions, they may be mistaken. There are means that China has taken, I broke my own rule, the PRC has taken and will take to censor you, regardless of where you live.
I never expected the conversation to go this way or these answers. It is honestly very interesting to me. In terms of the ideological approach coming out, the century of humiliation that they discuss, I found it interesting when my Chinese friends told me that at university they have to take mandatory courses in Xi Jinping thought.
Yes.
And this dumbfounded me. And I asked a few more students and they all said, yeah, that's right, that as part of to graduate from university, a mandatory course is that we have to study not communism, not political theory, but the thoughts and ideas of Chairman Xi Jinping as they are presented to us. And when I heard that, I realized, wow, I kind of don't understand China as much as I thought I did. That, that is going. Is China a great rising power? This is my next question for you, because compared to which news report you read, America is amazing or America sucks, and South Korea is booming or South Korea is on the verge of collapse. How do you see China at the moment? Is it doing well? Is it suffering? Is it going to overcome a demographic crisis? Is its economy all that good?
Its demographic crisis is real and it is looming, but then again, so is that of its neighbors. Yeah. I think one thing that we can say definitively that the PRC has in common with those countries previously mentioned, South Korea, Taiwan, et cetera, is that it is reaching the end of its boom period of time. The dirigist economy, that economic model seems to pay enormous dividends for a few decades at a time before it halts and it comes to an end. So the time period in which China was going to continuously produce 8 to 9% economic growth year upon year, that's over now, and its limitations are showing. But China is making very real, and I can say that because I can say China because we're talking about both public and private actors. They are making very real investments in technology, some of which I think startle Americans when they see them, some of the features that they have already put in place. And there have been reports about how much the PRC is investing in robotics and other technologies. So that concern that we have regarding the PRC potentially having an uncomfortable monopoly over specific high-tech features of our contemporary economy is still very real, even if the idea of them surpassing the United States in GDP is not. So they certainly have their issues regarding economic growth and what that means for the whole of society. If you've followed the North Korean refugee crisis in America or in South Korea and in China, a lot of that is fed into by the shortage of marriageable young women in China due to the one-child policy and the so-called bare branches in the Chinese provinces outside of the major metropolitan areas. So they absolutely do have concerns regarding demographics, regarding the economy, et cetera, but that's not cause for countries like ours to be complacent about what they still can do and the ways that they still can exploit vulnerabilities within our societies. Yes.
And so this brings us almost back round to the beginning, Rob, when we spoke about South Korean President Jae Myung and how he has to navigate this, because he's been, in your analysis at least, knowing the assignment with what to do with President Trump. And now the question is, how does he deal with Beijing and the CCP, not China, but how does he deal with Chairman Xi Jinping and the politics there? Because massive trade partners and geographically close, but also very strong anti-Chinese sentiment in some parts of South Korea.
Yes, and before I dive right into that question, you mentioned Xi Jinping thought.
Yeah.
Over the course of some research that I did earlier in the year on a project, I was visiting another country, in the Indo-Pacific, and we were investigating, some of the reporting on PRC influence in those countries, and I heard a story from a newspaper editor in one of these other countries who said that one of her reporters, who is of ethnic Chinese descent, was actually confronted by a staff member of the PRC embassy in their community and asked, "Why are you reporting on this? Why are you taking this position on this?" The assumption being that she, being of Chinese descent, would be on their side. And they said that the meeting concluded with him giving her a copy of Xi Jinping Thought, ostensibly to curry favor. So the idea that Xi Jinping Thought would be appealing to outsiders, I think it's genuine. I think they generally think that it's something that should appeal to us, once we encounter it in undoctored form. Now,
he's kind of unprecedented in being the first leader since Mao to do a third term, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
And he seems no sign of slowing down, or no immediate successors seem to be there.
Yes, Deng Xiaoping's idea that there should be a natural change in power, I think, was a reaction to Maoism and the extremes of it, and the views that one person's power being unchecked could be a problem for everybody, even if the power of the party remains unchallenged. one person having complete control basically indefinitely created problems for the party and for the country also. That seems to be something that Xi Jinping is moving away from. Deng Xiaoping also said, hide your strength and bide your time. And Xi Jinping has been much more extroverted in his displays of the PRC's authority and its ability to influence its neighbors. So yeah, they're moving away from that model. And that's something that America and its partners in the Indo-Pacific have to react to. Now, regarding...
Can I ask you one question quickly to interrupt you, please?
Okay.
Do you know what Xi Jinping thought is, or what that book might say? That's a different...
Yeah, that's... I can't say I have, gone into that tome over, in granular detail. Yeah. So, yes.
Next time.
Most people who have, tried to encounter Xi Jinping thought have mostly commented on it being impenetrable. Mm-hmm. So... That's a very, how shall I put this? I don't know.
Yeah. No,
yes,
no,
basically.
Yeah.
Yes. Xi Jinping thought is something, that I have not explored in detail. I only know that it's got a central role not only in how they manage things at home, but also how they engage outsiders. So that's their view of Xi Jinping thought.
I wonder if Jae Myung knows what it is.
I doubt it.
Yeah.
I doubt it. I think people in his position don't have a lot of time to read books, especially of that size. So I think Jae Myung, like his predecessors, I would say, knows that China occupies an extraordinarily large, share of South Korea's foreign trade. It was trending away from that under Yoon Suk-yeol. I think there was much more emphasis on diversification, which is still a very, important goal to have, I think, for South Korea's economy and for the economies of other countries in this region. Over-reliance on the PRC's economy, the PRC has demonstrated, whether it's with Korea after THAAD, whether it's with Japan, Australia, Vietnam, the Philippines, I could go on, that it is willing to use your reliance to hurt you.
The NBA,
yes.
South Park.
Yes. Yeah. So diversification is still a good goal to have, and I hope that the president continues down that path, but he will avoid unnecessary fights, if he can. Now, will good relations between South Korea and China continue? I would say to a degree that is up to the PRC. Remember, going into 2020, there was skepticism in many corridors toward China. But if you compare the start of 2020 to the end of the year, think of how many countries turned against the PRC in that time period. You had Australia suggest that there needed to be an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19, sanctions immediately, and public sentiment soured. You had India, skeptical, has a long history of rivalry and conflict with China, but not a whole lot of history of engagement with the United States either, and they were pretty content to keep things that way. Galwan Valley clash happens. Immediately, perception of China changes in India. The Philippines was ruled by a very China-friendly leader at the time, one who had shown a great willingness to accommodate China and to defy the United States. In the last year of Rodrigo Duterte's term, he had to turn away from that because people were unhappy with his China accommodationism. So, will South Korea's approach to China remain friendly? I would say a lot of that depends on what China does. A consistent theme in how people talk about China is arrogance. Among diplomats in particular, there's a view amongst the Chinese that either due to their large position, their size, their influence over other countries, or if they go into places like North America and they are criticized, they will respond in cultural terms like, we are a country of this many years of history. We are a great civilization. How dare you speak to us in this way? So, it may not be something that they can help.
Yeah, it's right there, and it looms large, and that's the task for President Yi. There's always the comment that he said share, and he's willing to play the assignment. That's perhaps the most interesting thing. You described him as a retail politician at the start, and he is adopting a very pragmatist approach rather than ideological. And I'm not sure if this is the time or if you still have any more thoughts on China, but when President Yoon Suk-yeol was impeached, one of the charges against him was being too friendly with Japan. That was seen as intolerable for many on the South Korean left. You're too nice to Japan, and we're coming up to Liberation Day now, and Korea-Japan relations are in the air. Under President Moon Jae-in from the Democratic Party, anti-Japanese sentiment was quite tangible here. There were no Japan signs in shops, and going on to even something like this, you wouldn't put an Asahi or a Sapporo beer on the table. That's kind of changed. I'm curious how you see Jae Myung doing Japan.
Probably will want to maintain the connections with Japan, and probably will want to keep the relationship progressing forward. I mean, Yoon Suk-yeol's initial outreach to Japan, I recall it being unpopular. I recall that it was, broadly speaking, not favored by the different segments of different age demographics in Korea, even the young voters who had propelled him to power and who were staunchly anti-China. I suspect that there is a difference between wanting to not be extroverted in the embrace of Japan and not wanting to draw a whole lot of attention to it versus trying to halt it completely and really trying to reverse course. Moon Jae-in seemed to have come into office in 2017 with a determination that he was going to go all in on inter-Korean reconciliation, and a big part of that seemed to be really leaning into this issue of Japan as part of the problem and as being the source of, I guess you could say, the source of dictatorship in South Korea, but also the source of separation, national division. And so that was seen in the decision on the Comfort Women Fund, the decision to contemplate the abrogation of GSMOIA, that agreement. I've never actually tried to pronounce that. Anyway, they considered abrogating that, and there were all these different incidences that took place between the Moon Jae-in government and the government of Japan, which to the outsider's perspective, or at least those who are concerned about the security dynamics in the region, seemed just unfathomable. I mean, the idea that Japan is considering rearming to the extent that they could recreate the Greater Asian Coke prosperity sphere is just absurd on its face. I mean, the Japanese military is not capable of that. The United States is just hoping that the Japanese military will be in a position one day where if there is, God forbid, an attack on Taiwan, Japan will be able to make a meaningful contribution to Taiwan's defense. They're not there yet, and there's very real concern that they never will be. From our perspective, the idea that they are now a threat to South Korea, it just boggles the mind to people outside of that bubble. Now, I know other people will look at the history of Japan, Korea, and say South Korea has legitimate claims, and they have very real grievances regarding how Japan has behaved toward them in the past and how they acknowledge that treatment today. And I think that is something that is true, and I think that there are issues certainly that can be raised. I just want people here to understand the nature of the security environment that they are in, and that is not one where Japan legitimately threatens South Korea. It just does not. So Japan certainly has played a role in those tensions, and I have degree of ambivalence with how Abe Shinzo handled himself during his tenure. I think he did a lot of multilateral institution building in this part of the world, and he really did a great deal to restore Japan as a great diplomatic player. He also rubbed salt in Koreans' wounds, and I think that that is something that has to be acknowledged when you consider his legacy. Now that he's gone, I think it was much easier for Yoon Suk-yeol to go visit Kishida than it was to go visit Abe Shinzo, certainly. And hopefully the successors, Ishiba and those after him, will also continue a conciliatory approach toward South Korea. I personally, my wish list is that the Japanese leadership would forcefully rebuke Japanese nationalists who want to make an issue of Dokdo and who want to talk about the great things that Japanese colonization brought to South Korea. I would love it if they were willing to step up and say, this is not productive right now. South Korea is a valued partner. Okay, we do not need to continuously remind them of the historical grievances that they have. So it goes both ways. Both South Korea and Japan really should be thinking about the need for cooperation if they are going to continue to have the degree of freedom that they currently enjoy in the international sphere, and possibly even domestically.
Yeah. History is real, but then so is the future, and they need to understand that. Considering everything that we've said so far, Rob, and also taking into account the various other situations around the world, Ukraine, Gaza, such forth, can you say something about the future now? Can you say something about how, because we both have children, and we both sort of international relations and policy, you look at that, how do you see the 21st century playing out? Is it going to be much different from now?
There's no question that the international order, as we call it, is facing challenges to a degree that we have not seen in our lifetimes. There was too much confidence in the fall of the Iron Curtain and what it meant for the future of humanity. The United States became particularly complacent and also distracted by conflicts in other parts of the world and its desire to remake other parts of the world in its image, when it really lost sight of the longer term perspective and the longer term challenges that would be raised by China's rise, and also I would say by the views within Russia, for instance. Okay, there was a view for a very long time that Russians were partners now, and that they had put that period of time behind them. They put communism behind them, but they never put behind them the view of themselves as a civilization themselves, and as a great power that could regain its former prestige. So the understanding, we may not think very much of nationalism as an idea. We may think of things more globally, and try to see ourselves as citizens of the world, but nationalism is real regardless of whether we like it or not, and it has a great deal of appeal to people wherever they may be. And now with China, with the PRC on the ascent, and with Russia having fully embraced the leader-driven model that we thought they had gotten away from, and with those two acting in concert with one another, there's a very real challenge to the global system of norms and values that we've never really seen before. And in the United States, there is quite frequently a lack of appreciation for what international cooperation has brought to them. There's just a general sense of things aren't as good as they used to be, and that's because we don't take care of our own. That's the common perception of the United States and its government right now, that we don't do enough to take care of our own. We are too focused on what benefit we can bring to others. I mean, what's good for the world is generally what's good for the United States, in my view. and the view of many others in this community that we're part of. And I think there are ways of addressing the concerns that Middle America has regarding its prospects and its future without turning our backs on the international community. And so it's going to be the challenge for people in my line of work and related fields to continue to demonstrate the benefits of international cooperation. There's a statement circulating in certain circles about how strong men create good times create weak people, and weak people create hard times. That is true in the sense that good times create complacency, and good times create a lack of appreciation for what you have and a desire to unmake the system and try to remake it. That has the potential to cause a lot of damage.
And we are experiencing good times, whatever might be said, in that we generally have freedom to look at what we want, to say what we want, to meet who we want, and we're not burdened by the tragedy, devastation of famine, war, or these things which have afflicted the world in the past. I'm not sure, having had this conversation now, whether to go home and read all my Mearsheimer books again or to burn them. Something has to be done. You've done this. Is there anything we've missed here? As we bring this to a close, Rob, is there any kind of observation, any topic, any thought that you think we didn't get that on record, or that hasn't been said, or have we covered it all?
Well, certainly read Mearsheimer. That's definitely something you should do. You should read Mearsheimer. You should read Graham Allison. I absolutely encourage people to do that. I just don't encourage people to agree with it all the time. Yeah. I think too much, like I said, when people hear the term realism or, realist foreign policy, they think, well, that sounds great. Who doesn't want to be realistic? If you look at realism in practice, and it goes back to the Million dialogue in Greece, the strong nations do what they can and weak suffer what they must. I like to joke, I joked when Kissinger died, like, people hear realism and they think realistic. What it means in practice is small countries don't matter, especially Ukraine and Cambodia. So that's the problem with Mearsheimer. And I don't mean to single him out specifically. That's the problem with realist thought in general, which is treating small countries like they don't matter is the problem. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Now, South Korea is a very good evidence for why countries of this size do matter.
They do matter, and also personality matters. I always found that lacking when I looked at realism and international relations theory, and I was like, but surely the personality of leaders matters. That's that's what I found in Kenneth Waltz and Hans Morgenthau, things like that I always felt a little bit absent from Mearsheimer's work.
Yes, and you talked about, good times. I think there have been studies that said that fanaticism actually is strongest amongst people who are materially comfortable.
Okay.
Yeah. So fanaticism is not strong amongst people who are struggling, who are economically deprived. They have concerns other than that. They have much more practical concerns about being fed and sheltered. But people who are in a state of relative material comfort, but who have maybe not achieved all that they wanted to, can be more easily susceptible to fanaticism. And that, I think, is driving a lot of politics in the world today.
I think that's brilliant. Thank you for today. Like, I never expected the answers that you gave me, and it was honestly a tour de force of analysis, Mr. Rob York. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Good. Relax. That's it. That was brilliant, man.